and welcome to our first lecture on art from Africa. So, reminder, Africa is an entire continent, not a country, and it's so massive that just the east coast of our contiguous U.S. is basically the coastline of Somalia. So if we were looking at the true size of Africa, all of these countries, USA, China, India, Eastern Europe, etc., all of them would fit into the continent of Africa. So we are looking at a large group of people, a massive continent. And also, it should be noted that the current political boundaries are entirely inaccurate of the people who have resided here for many, many years. We're going to be looking primarily at sub-Saharan Africa. And we're looking at, consider this map with all of these different language families. And here is more of our ethnic groups. Here's a ethnic map made in '59, and you can see just how complex this is and how these current political borders do not reflect the ethnic groups within Africa. In fact, many of them will overlap several borders. So these borders were actually made during the Berlin Conference, 1884 to 85, where these European powers that were dominating and colonizing Africa had a round table group session, and they decided the political borders, some of which had never stepped foot even on Africa. So even the earliest one in 1554 was made by a German who had never stepped foot in Africa. So the political map does not reflect the actual ethnic and tribal map of the many, many groups of people within Africa. Okay. There's also a common misconception that the geometric patterns and the more or less realistic looking art indicates that these artisans were not well trained or that they were incapable of doing these artworks. And just like other cultures that we've studied, that's entirely inaccurate. These artists were completely capable of creating realistic images, such as these bronze heads found in Ife by the Yoruba people, 14th or 15th century bronze. You have a few assigned resources. One of them is over these artworks, particularly the depiction of the king. These are found in the British Museum. So when they were first found, there was even such a prejudice against African art that they assumed that, these African peoples had been taught this by the European settlers or colonizers. But that, of course, that's entirely inaccurate. The point of many of these artworks is not a realistic representation. They're not supposed to represent reality. They're supposed to represent these concepts. They're expressive. So consider how we've discussed this importance of agency and how these artworks are meant to have an impact on the viewer. And in many of the works we'll study today, they're meant to be part of a ceremonial ritual. They're so much more than just these aesthetically pleasing objects. The point is not to create a realistic looking object in a certain medium, but the point is to express a particular concept. So note that these artisans are entirely capable of creating realistic works of art. We are in Nigeria, by the Yoruba's people. Okay, here's some of the king, which you're assigned resources over. This is using the lost wax method of cast bronze, and you have an assigned video over that to better understand the process. Note that this video also discusses how these lines on the faces of the nobility is likely scarification. This was a common practice to denote certain tribes. And so it's a likely hypothesis. Okay. So again, extremely, extremely realistic, and an extremely skilled craftsman made these objects. Okay, so remember, much of the artwork we're studying is valuing, they're more expressive and conceptual rather than trying to represent reality. Okay, so some general commonalities across this massive continent is we're going to see a combination of objects, acts, and events created using a range of media and materials. So again, many of these objects are used within a larger context, a larger setting of some type of ritual process or ceremony. They're created by recognized artists. Many are supernaturally ordained by their people. The process of creating these artworks is extremely valuable and spiritual. They reflect the belief systems of that society. They're concerned with the intellectual and societal beliefs rather than so much the natural or physical world, and created for specific purposes and daily or ritual practices. Some have this agency and have this power only within these ritual practices. The context and function are important. They're an integral part of social life. They're going to mark identity, reflect social status, or convey history, mark leaders' accomplishments, or commemorate cycles of human experience. Many of the cultures that we'll study don't have a written language, and so the oral traditions are passed down oftentimes through these artworks. They help to communicate these important historical events or aspects of society, accomplishments, commemorate cycles of the human experience. And the aesthetic choices and artistic expression reflect personal identity, social status, relationships of the patrons. The geometric designs are often symbolic, they're intentional, they differ from region to region. Many considered these artworks primitive by outsiders, and this ignorance has resulted in names, contextual information, and dates of creation that are missing. And African history is largely preserved in oral tradition. Okay, so let's head down to Zimbabwe, where we're looking at the Shona peoples. So you have an assigned resource over this. I like to show videos for architecture for you to get a better idea of them. So not much is known about this conical tower and the circular wall. It's about 800 feet tall, 800 feet long, 32 feet tall. And at the base, some of the parts of this wall are about 17 feet thick. It's made up of these these coarse granite blocks. And so at its peak, the Shona people had about 1,800 acres and about 18,000 people, referred to as Great Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe actually is a Shona term, and it means venerated houses or houses of stone. So this further reflects how prosperous this community was, and that it was a prosperous trading center. It's along numerous trading routes and a royal complex. So the stone is also mortarless. So consider how we talked about the Incas. They weren't using mortar in between. And then several structures are believed to have housed the royals, a palace structure. The conical towers, some suggest that it resembles a granary, so perhaps it's associated with the storage of food, and this indicates wealth and status. From the beginning of the first civilization in Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, whoever controlled the food source controlled the power, controlled the people. And so if you are storing the excess granary, the excess food, this further indicates your status and as well your control and power. The circular wall has these beautiful detailed geometric details across it. Again, there's this style, this architectural, purposeful style, which would have been more elaborate in its heyday, of course. Okay, so as we move into sculptures, note that most sculptures across the continent are portable. They're smaller. They're not colossal, these massive colossal statues. And portable not so much for a nomadic lifestyle, but more for the specific rituals and ceremonies that they're a part of. They're moved around, essentially. Wood is the favorite medium that we'll look at, but the wood was taken from trees, of course, and they were honored and symbolically repaid for the branches taken from them. Ivory is sometimes used, and it's a sign of rank or prestige. Metal shows strength and durability, and is primarily restricted just to royalty. And stone sculptures are pretty rare. And we often see multiple media. Wood sculptures adorned with feathers, fabric, or beads, etc. And the geometry of forms, they avoid physical reality. The intention is not to represent reality, but they're representing beyond reality, the spiritual world, or idealized values of an individual, etc. And so proportions are manipulated to emphasize these values. So again, they're more expressive and conceptual rather than representational and realistic. The depiction of a body, they're normally frontal, full-faced, with attention paid to the sides. Symmetry is occasionally used, but the more talented artists will vary their approaches on each side. Proportions are often exaggerated or manipulated, and that's intentional. For example, heads are often disproportionately large across many cultures, sometimes a third of the body, and that's to emphasize the intelligence, the wisdom of this person, or the other values related to their character traits that are idealized for that particular person. Sexual characteristics are often enlarged. The bodies look somewhat immature and small, but the emphasis isn't on the body. It's more on the character traits and qualities that are valued. There's not an emphasis on hands or feet. They're small. They're not part of this, what's meant to be communicated. We rarely see fingers depicted. So again, they're focusing more on like the idealized virtues or the purpose of this object in this ritual practice rather than realism. And of course, these aren't done for decoration. They aren't meant to just be these static art objects that you admire. They're functional. And in fact, remember how we were talking about with the indigenous art of America and how the transformation mask was part of a full costume and part of a full ceremony? Similar here is where these African masks that we'll look at are part of a full costume. And through this process of movement, etc., you have an assigned resource over that, a video demonstrating this, then this person wearing this mask in the full costume represent that spirit. It comes alive, that they are embodied with the spirit in these ceremonies. Or every mask has a different purpose, representing a different spirit or idea. And when they're worn in a ceremony, again, the spirit will take over the identity, and then they fully embody and represent that spirit. Or I guess I should say the spirit comes through them. So these mask dancers connect to the spiritual world. And this helps to communicate the values and ideals of the society as well as the oral history. Okay, so we're looking over Benin and Nigeria. So remember, these political boundaries do not reflect the ethnic groups that were here before these boundaries. And so we're looking at the Edo peoples who overlap these boundaries. And we're looking at cast brass here. Okay, so we are looking at the wall plaque of the Oba and his attendants. So the Oba is the king. This was ripped off the interior of the Oba's palace. This is of the Edo's peoples. Again, this overlaps into the current political boundaries of Benin and Nigeria. 16th century cast brass. So remember, our medals are reserved for royalty. And so what we're seeing is a depiction of royalty. And notice the similarities between this picture of the Oba and here is the wall plaque. The coral that we see that stands out to you the most was actually from the Portuguese. So for a long period of time, the Portuguese and the Edo peoples had a very mutually beneficial trade relationship. And so this orange coral that we see here that's valued was given to them by the Portuguese during this period of trade. And so we see these, the depiction of a headdress as well as the necklaces on the wall plaque, as well as the attendants surrounding him with these, in this case, either shields or fans above him, helping to protect him. So let's go into some of these wall plaques. So many museums across the globe have these wall plaques. So there were over 900 plaques of this style. They're located in museums across the globe. They're about 16 to 18 inches tall. And they were actually taken from the Oba's palace. They decorated the walls of the interior formal gathering room. So the formal room in which they, this ceremonial room where they would meet visitors to this kingdom. And so what these plaques represented, you can see, here's a depiction of an earlier one, and over a period of centuries is they depict the historical events and royal lineage. And so they decorated the walls of this interior. So you would walk in, and here you are met with the visual history of this people. They even decorated the columns. You can see this narrow one decorating the columns, etc. So it covered the interior. And they would have been shinier and well kept, etc. And so this depicts ceremonial rituals and court rituals and really reinforces the power of the Oba, of the king. He's considered the direct descendant of the spirit of the founder of the Benin dynasty. He is both the secular and spiritual ruler of the kingdom. He's considered a living deity, essentially. So when these plaques, you can see how they were, really violently ripped off the walls. You can see the nails in which they would have been nailed into, and look how you can imagine how they were just ripped off the wall. And that was during the Benin expedition of 1897, where the British conquered this region and looted it, essentially. And so there's a lot of outrage over these artworks being located in museums elsewhere. This, interestingly enough, shows depictions of the Portuguese. So let's talk about this specific plaque, the equestrian Oba and his attendant. So equestrian, meaning he is on a horse, which had been brought over by the Europeans. Same with North and South America. Horses, for a long time, were not part of or indigenous to these continents. And so let's talk about some formal elements. So the composition tells us who's the most important. We have the king, the Oba, who is centrally placed. Okay. This is somewhat symmetrical on either side of him, but our attention is drawn to him. If we're analyzing line, then line is constantly used to draw our eyes back to the king, back to the Oba. Okay. We also have hierarchy of scale that we've mentioned before, where the Oba is the largest person. And this re-emphasizes his importance. He's even larger than the horse. He's larger than these minor attendants compared to his more up on the social hierarchy attendants. So he is the largest as well. Now remember, our emphasis is on certain traits. So we have the larger head, which is characteristic. We'll see other depictions of larger foreheads, etc. In this case, the larger head. So consider the emphasis on intelligence, of wisdom, etc., that a king would need. This helps to denote the valued characteristics of a ruler. He's also in all this jewelry. We saw the coral depiction in the picture, but consider all the other details that he is adorned with, from the necklaces to the bracelets, even to where his outfit is the outfit that he's wearing is even more detailed than those around him. This figure is the smallest. He's also nude, so that indicates his lower status. Or, sorry, not the smallest. We have these other very minor attendants around him. But his importance is really emphasized. We have his attendants with weapons. They're holding these shields or fans over him to protect him. Oftentimes, an artistic indicator of power and status is that a person is depicted as seated, and this is across the globe much of time. And so the fact that he is on a horse and seated, elevated, also helps to reinforce his importance. And so consider the amount of detail that went into creating this piece. These tiny details. These rosettes on the back, some have claimed that it is relative to looks like a cross brought by the Portuguese, but I've also read about how this more represents Sowe, the water spirit, and so every culture in the globe needs water for survival, so there's usually an emphasis on that. That makes sense. And with the value of the coral, Now, there's another element of an emphasis on water and importance of it. So, differing opinions on what the rosettes mean. But there is equestrian oba and the attendants. So again, here's a more modern depiction. I think it's from the 80s. So these heads from the Benin heads are also controversial objects where they were part of this looting process. They were made in this lost wax technique that you were supposed to watch that video over. So here's a depiction of within the interior of the oba's compound, and we're looking at this ancestral shrine where we see these depictions of previous obas. These are important objects. They are more than just some aesthetically pleasing thing to look at. They held significance and told of the history and importance of these individuals. And so there's been a big push for these to be returned to their country of origin. Numerous museums have sent them back, numerous others haven't. I don't have an answer. As much as we'd like not to think of it, but the museum is the authority on art, so if they create an exhibition, then that elevates the status of this art. And with our major museums, such as the British Museum, with an exhibition, a permanent exhibition on African art, that really helped elevate the status of African art, and finally seeing these objects as important to the survey, the narrative of art history. And so, I don't know, maybe pictures of these art objects and bringing them back. I don't have an answer. So this community was kingdom under the Oba. We have early drawings of it. Expansive before they were conquered. So our equestrian statue of Oba with his attendants. Okay, and we will head to the DRC tomorrow.